Before we begin, if you enjoy stepping into the strange and often uncomfortable shoes of history's overlooked figures, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Tonight's story is another installment in our series of boring bedtime tales, where the past is anything but peaceful. Chapter 1. The Call to Duty. The life of a medieval bell ringer was one of quiet pride and unspoken dread. By day it was a respectable job, a position of minor prestige. The bell ringer was the town's human clock, the herald of holy days, the voice of celebration and sorrow. But when war came knocking, when the siege towers rolled in and the air thickened with the smell of burning pitch, the bell ringer's role shifted from ceremonial to catastrophic. Take poor brother Anselm, for instance. A man of modest stature and unremarkable face, he had spent 20 years pulling the ropes of the great cathedral bell in the fortified town of Bourvaux. His hands were calloused, his ears perpetually ringing, his back slightly hunched from a lifetime of looking up at the bell tower's shadow. He was, by all accounts, a man content with his lot. The townsfolk knew him as a reliable soul, the kind who never missed a toll, not even on the feast days when the wine flowed freely and the rest of the clergy were half drunk by noon. But contentedness in the Middle Ages was a fragile thing, like a clay jug balanced on the edge of a well. One day the scouts came rushing in from the eastern road, their horses lathered in sweat, their voices ragged with panic. The Duke's army was marching. Not for a parley, not for a show of force, but for blood. The town gates were sealed, the granaries stocked, the militia called to arms. And Brother Anselm? He was ordered to keep ringing the bell. Now, here was the problem. During a siege, the bell was both a tool and a target. Ring it too much, and you'd exhaust yourself before the real fighting even began. Ring it too little, and the captain of the guard would accuse you of cowardice. Worse still, the enemy knew exactly where the sound was coming from. A bell tower was impossible to miss, a giant, noisy beacon saying, "Here we are, shoot here." On the first day of the siege, Anselm climbed the tower steps as usual, his sandals scuffing against the worn stone. The ropes were rough in his hands, the bell's familiar weight swaying slightly in the breeze. He took a deep breath and pulled. The sound shuddered through the town, a deep, resonant call to prayer. Or in this case, a call to huddle behind thick walls and hope the enemy ran out of arrows before you ran out of food. By the third day the novelty had worn off. The Duke's archers had taken a liking to aiming at the tower, and though the arrow slits were narrow, every now and then a lucky shot would zip through, embedding itself in the wooden beams with a thunk. Anselm developed a habit of crouching mid-toll, as if the bell itself could shield him. It couldn't. The townsfolk, meanwhile, had begun to resent the sound. The bell was supposed to be comforting, a reminder of order in chaos. But when the granaries started running low, and the first cases of dysentery broke out, the constant clanging became a taunt. Every toll was a reminder that they were trapped, that the world outside was hostile, and that the man responsible for the noise was, at that very moment, probably dodging arrows while they dodged starvation. Then came the rain. A downpour so relentless it turned the enemy's camp into a swamp, and the town's streets into shallow rivers. The bell, usually so clear, now sounded like a drunkard banging a pot. Anselm, soaked to the bone and shivering, wondered if God had a particular grudge against bell ringers. But duty was duty, and so, with numb fingers and a growing sense of absurdity, he kept ringing. Because in a world where kings and dukes decided the fates of men on a whim, the bell ringer's job was simple: make noise until someone told you to stop, or until an arrow finally found its mark. The siege dragged on. The bell kept ringing. And Brother Anselm, now more than ever, wished he'd taken up farming instead. Chapter 2. The siege begins. The first thing Brother Anselm noticed was the dust. A great billowing cloud of it rising above the eastern road like a slow-moving storm. Then came the sound, Not the rhythmic tramp of marching feet, but the chaotic rumble of carts, the clank of armor, and the occasional shout of orders cutting through the haze. He had been in the middle of ringing the noon bell when the watchman's horn blasted from the walls. A sound so sharp and sudden that Anselm's hands slipped on the rope, sending the bell into an unsteady, off-kilter clang. He leaned out of the tower window, squinting against the sun. The enemy wasn't even trying to hide their approach. They came in a disorderly sprawl, men on foot dragging supply carts, mounted knights trotting ahead with banners flapping limply in the wind. And at the center of it all, the Duke's standard, a snarling boar on a field of red stitched with enough gold thread to feed Bourvaux for a year. Anselm swallowed hard. He had seen soldiers before, of course. Bourvaux was a fortified town, and guards drilled in the square often enough that the sight of men in mail had lost its novelty. But this was different. These men weren't here to patrol or parade. They were here to break things. The captain of the guard, a grizzled veteran named Reynard, found Anselm still gaping from the tower when he stormed in, his boots leaving muddy prints on the worn stairs. "You're still ringing?" he barked, as if Anselm had personally invited the enemy by being too diligent in his duties. Anselm blinked. "It's noon." Reynard rubbed his forehead, looking suddenly very tired. "Right. Well, from now on you ring when I say. No more schedules. We'll use the bell for warnings, for rallying, for whatever the hell else we need." "Understood." Anselm nodded, though privately he wondered what good a bell do against an army. It wasn't as though the enemy would hear it and politely turn around. Still, he kept his mouth shut. Reynard had the look of a man one wrong word away from throwing someone off the battlements. By evening, the Duke's forces had settled into position. Tents sprouted like mushrooms across the fields outside the walls, and the glow of campfires dotted the dusk. Anselm watched from the tower as men moved about their routines, sharpening blades, tending horses, laughing at some joke lost to the distance. It was almost peaceful, if you ignored the fact that these same men would likely be trying to kill everyone inside the walls by morning. The first attack came at dawn. Anselm had been dozing against the bell tower wall, his neck stiff from an awkward night's sleep when the shouting started. He jerked upright, scrambling to the window, in time to see a volley of arrows arc through the sky, darkening the sunrise for a brief, terrible moment. They clattered against the walls, skittered off roofs, thudded into the occasional unlucky soul who hadn't ducked in time. Then the bell rope was in his hands, and he was pulling, the deep toll reverberating through the tower, through his bones, through the suddenly very awake town below. He didn't stop, not even when his arms burned and his breath came in ragged gasps. The bell was the town's voice now, screaming when its people couldn't. Somewhere below, Reynard was bellowing orders, the militia was forming up, and the women and children were being herded into the cellars. Anselm, meanwhile, was realizing three things in rapid succession. First, that the tower was the tallest structure in Bourvaux, making it an excellent target. Second, that the enemy had brought siege engines, which were currently being wheeled into position with alarming efficiency. And third, that if he survived this, he was absolutely demanding a raise. A stone from a catapult slammed into the wall just below the tower, shaking the floor beneath his feet. Dust rained from the ceiling. Anselm coughed, his eyes watering, but he kept ringing. What else was there to do? Fleeing would mean abandoning his post, and worse, it would mean running through the streets, where arrows and stray stones were now falling like lethal hail. So he rang. He rang as the enemy's ladders clattered against the walls, as the townsfolk hurled rocks and boiling oil down on them, as the air filled with the mingled stench of smoke and blood. He rang until his hands blistered, until the sound was less a call to arms, and more a desperate, wordless plea for mercy. And through it all, one thought circled in his mind like a vulture. This was only the first day. Chapter 3. The Tower's Perch. By the second week of the siege, Brother Anselm had developed a routine for survival. He woke before dawn, when the air was still thick with the snores of soldiers sleeping in shifts along the tower stairs. He ate whatever meager scraps had been left for him, usually stale bread and a bit of cheese if he was lucky. And then he climbed. The steps, worn smooth by centuries of dutiful bell ringers, had become his own personal purgatory. Every morning he counted them, not out of piety or discipline, but because focusing on the numbers kept him from thinking about how high he was, how exposed, how utterly doomed. The tower was a magnificent structure in peacetime. Tall enough to see the surrounding countryside for miles, its arched windows allowed the bell's voice to carry across the town and beyond. But in war, those same qualities made it a death trap. The height that once inspired awe now made him the most visible target in Bordeaux. The windows that let the sound out also let arrows in. And the bell itself, that great bronze beast, had become both his duty and his curse. Anselm had taken to crouching behind the bell when the enemy archers grew particularly bold. It was a poor shield. Arrows could still find the gaps, but it was better than standing in the open like a scarecrow at a tournament. He had also learned to distinguish the sounds of different projectiles. Arrows hissed, stones thudded, and the occasional flaming bolt, launched from some enterprising soul with a grudge against bell ringers, made a noise like an angry wasp before setting fire to whatever it hit. One particularly clear morning, as Anselm leaned out to assess the damage to the town below, an arrow whizzed past his ear so close he felt the fletching brush his cheek. He jerked back, heart hammering, and pressed himself against the cold stone wall. The archer, whoever he was, had good aim. Too good. From his perch, Anselm had a perfect view of the battlefield, if one could call it that. The Duke's forces had dug in, their trenches and earthworks creeping ever closer to the walls. Ziege engines loomed like skeletal beasts, their arms cocked and ready. And the men, there were so many of them, more than Bordeaux could ever hope to repel in a straight fight. Down in the streets, the townsfolk moved like ghosts. The once bustling market square was empty, save for the occasional patrol. The wells were guarded now, not because they feared poison, though that was always a possibility, but because water had become precious. Anselm had heard whispers of rationing, of families hiding what little they had, of the first cracks in discipline as hunger gnawed at morale. And then there was the smell. It started as a faint whiff of something unpleasant, something that clung to the back of the throat. But as the days passed and the siege wore on, it grew stronger. Smoke from the fires, yes, but also the lingering stench of unwashed bodies, of sickness, of the latrines that could no longer be emptied beyond the walls. The tower, at least, caught the breeze, sparing Anselm the worst of it. But he knew that below, in the cramped houses and cellars, the air must have been thick with misery. His only company, aside from the occasional messenger or guard checking on him, was the bell. It had no opinions, no complaints, no fear. It simply waited, patient and heavy, for his hands to set it ringing. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between attacks, Anselm talked to it. Not prayers. He had given up on those after the third near miss with an arrow, but ordinary things. The weather, the food, the fact that his back ached from sleeping on stone. It was on one such afternoon, as he sat with his back against the bell and nibbled a piece of hardtack, that Reynard appeared in the doorway, looking more ragged than Anselm had ever seen him. His mail was dented, his face streaked with soot, and his left arm wrapped in a bloody bandage. "You're still alive," Reynard said, as though he hadn't expected to find him so. Anselm shrugged. "No one's shot me yet." Reynard grunted and stepped closer, peering out the window at the enemy lines. "They're building a ram." Anselm followed his gaze. Sure enough, a team of men were hauling a massive log toward the gates, its iron-shod head gleaming in the sun. "That's not ideal." "Understatement of the century," Reynard muttered. He turned back to Anselm, his expression grim. "When they start the assault, I need you to ring like hell. Not just tolls, continuous. The louder, the better. We have to drown out their signals, keep our men from panicking. Can you do that? Anselm looked at the bell, then at his already blistered hands. Do I have a choice? Reynard clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that might have been reassuring if not for the wince it drew from Anselm. That's the spirit. As Reynard left, Anselm sighed and flexed his fingers. The ram would come. The bell would ring. And he, Brother Anselm, would once again be the most hated man in Bordeaux. Not because he was cruel, not because he was lazy, but because he was the one who had to remind everyone over and over that the world was falling apart. He wondered if the enemy's bell ringer was having a better time of it. Probably. The Duke's men weren't the ones under siege. With a groan he stood, grabbed the rope, and waited for the inevitable. Chapter 4. The first arrow. The morning the ram arrived at the gates, Brother Anselm knew his luck had run out. He had just taken hold of the bell rope when he heard the first unmistakable twang of bowstrings from below. It was a sound he had learned to dread, a sound that turned his stomach to ice even before the arrows found their mark. The first volley was high, too high, clattering against the roof tiles like a handful of pebbles tossed by an impatient child. But the second flight was better aimed. Anselm saw them coming. A dark blur streaking upward, growing larger, sharper, until he could make out the fletching, the wicked iron tips, the slight wobble in their flight. He dropped the rope and threw himself behind the bell, pressing his back against the cold bronze as arrows thudded into the wooden beams around him. One struck the bell itself with a high metallic ping, leaving a dent he would later examine with morbid fascination. Another embedded itself in the wall, where his head had been moments before. Silence followed. Then from below, the distant sound of laughter. Anselm stayed where he was, breathing hard. His hands shook. His knees felt weak. Some part of him, the part that still remembered the quiet piety of the monastery, wanted to pray. But the larger part, the part that had spent weeks dodging death in a bell tower, was too busy being furious. They were shooting at him. Specifically, not at the walls, not at the guards, but at him. A man whose entire contribution to the war effort was making noise on schedule. It was absurd. It was unfair. It was, he realized with a sinking feeling, exactly what he should have expected. The bell rope swayed gently in the breeze, taunting him. Reynard had ordered him to ring continuously during the assault, to drown out the enemy's signals. But Reynard wasn't the one up here with arrows sticking out of the walls, like some grotesque hedgehog. Anselm peered around the edge of the bell. The ram was moving now, a dozen men straining at the ropes as they hauled it toward the gates. The defenders on the walls were shouting, hurling rocks, tipping cauldrons of boiling oil, all the usual desperate measures. None of it seemed to be working. He took a deep breath, grabbed the rope, and pulled. The bell's voice boomed out, deep and resonant, shaking the tower with its force. Anselm barely had time to register the sound before another volley of arrows came hissing up at him. This time one grazed his arm, slicing through his sleeve and drawing a thin line of blood. He yelped, more in surprise than pain, and ducked again. This was impossible. He couldn't ring and dodge at the same time. And yet, if he stopped, the town would lose its one advantage, the ability to coordinate, to rally, to drown out the enemy's commands. Anselm wiped his bleeding arm on his robes and considered his options. He could abandon the tower and face Reynard's wrath. He could stay and risk becoming a pincushion. Or he could try something stupid. Stupid one. He waited for the next lull in the arrow fire, because even archers needed to breathe, then lunged for the rope. 1 pull. 2 D. On the third, he heard the telltale twang of bows, and threw himself sideways, landing hard on the stone floor as arrows peppered the space he'd just occupied. The bell kept swinging, its momentum carrying it through another deafening ring, while Anselm lay on his back, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this counted as heroism, or just spectacularly bad life choices. From below, the ram struck the gates with a thunderous crash. The sound reverberated through the town, shaking loose dust from the rafters. Anselm scrambled to his feet and risked another glance out the window. The gates held, for now, but the wood was splintering. He grabbed the rope again. The bell wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a defiance, a refusal to let the enemy have the last word. Let them shoot. Let them laugh. He would ring this damned thing until his arms gave out or an arrow finally shut him up for good. The next volley came faster than he expected. One arrow clipped his ear, sending a hot spike of pain through his skull. Another buried itself in the rope just above his hand, the fibers parting with a soft snap. The bell gave one last, mournful toll before the rope went slack in his grip. Silence fell. Anselm stared at the severed rope, then at the arrows still quivering in the walls. The bell, his constant companion, his tormentor and shield, was mute. Somewhere below, the ram struck again. The gates groaned, and Brother Anselm, blood trickling down his neck, and his hands raw from rope burns, did the only thing he could think to do. He laughed. Chapter 5. The Sound of Doom. The silence after the rope snapped felt heavier than the bell itself. Anselm stood motionless, strands of frayed hemp dangling from his hands, staring at the mute bronze giant that had been his prison, his purpose, and his curse for weeks. Outside, the rhythmic thud of the ram continued, each blow shaking the town's bones. Without the bell's voice to rally them, the defenders' shouts sounded scattered, panicked. He had failed. Spectacularly. And yet, as blood dripped from his torn ear onto the stone floor, he couldn't help feeling a perverse relief. At least now they'd stopped shooting at him. The thought lasted precisely 3 breaths before the trapdoor to the tower burst open and Reynard's soot-streaked face appeared, eyes wild. "Why the hell did you stop?" he roared, voice cracking with something that might have been fear. Anselm held up the severed rope like a fisherman displaying a pitiful catch. They shot it. Reynard swore with such creative fervor that Anselm made a mental note to remember the phrasing for future use. The captain lunged forward, grabbing the rope ends and trying to knot them together with hands trembling from exhaustion. The fibers refused to hold. There through the outer gate, Reynard muttered, more to himself than Anselm. "If we can't coordinate the barricades." A new sound cut through the chaos below, an eerie, synchronized chant from the Duke's men as the ram's blows grew faster. Anselm didn't need to see it to know what was happening. Momentum was shifting. The tide was turning. And Bourvau's last line of defense was a mute bell and a bleeding monk. Then Reynard did something unexpected. He unbuckled his sword belt. "Put this on," he ordered, thrusting the scabbard at Anselm. Anselm blinked. "I don't know how to—" "Not the sword, you idiot. The belt." Reynard was already striding to the bell, running his hands along its weathered surface until he found what he was looking for, the iron clapper still swaying slightly from its last toll. With a grunt he looped the belt around it and yanked hard. The leather creaked but held. "Grab the other end," he snapped. Understanding dawned. Anselm seized the belt's free end just as another crash shook the tower. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere below, timber splintered with a sound like a dying beast. Together, they pulled. The improvised rope jerked taut. The belt groaned. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a reluctant shudder, the bell moved. The sound wasn't clean like before, no deep, resonant toll to shake the heavens. This was a ragged, metallic cough, the clapper striking at an odd angle, the note warped by the leather's give. But it was sound. It was defiance. Anselm expected the arrows to resume immediately. Strangely, none came. Instead, a new noise rose from below, Not the roar of attackers, but something between a gasp and a cheer. He risked a glance out the window and saw why. The ram was stuck. Whether by design or desperation, someone had managed to drop the portcullis at the last second. The iron spikes had driven deep into the ram's frame, pinning it mid-swing. The Duke's men were scrambling like ants, some trying to free it, others falling back as boiling oil rained down. Reynard let out a hoarse laugh. "They heard you." Anselm wasn't sure if he meant the defenders or the enemy. It didn't matter. They pulled again. This time the bell's voice was stronger, clearer. The leather stretched but held. Across the town, Anselm saw heads turn, saw men rallying to the sound, saw the tide of battle shift. Just slightly. Back in their favor. And then he saw the archers. Not the scattered opportunistic shots from before. A full dozen men kneeling in perfect formation, bows raised, arrows nocked, all trained on the tower. On him. Anselm met their commander's eyes across the distance. The man smiled. The bell tolled one last time as the arrows flew. Chapter 6. Hunger in the heights. The arrows missed. Not all of them, of course. One buried itself in Anselm's sleeve without touching flesh, pinning the fabric to the wooden beam behind him. Another grazed his thigh, leaving a stinging line of fire. But by some miracle, or more likely, by the archer's overconfidence at such an easy shot, he remained unpierced in any vital areas. Reynard had no such luck. An arrow had caught him in the shoulder, its shaft protruding like some grotesque new limb. He cursed, snapped it off, and kept pulling the makeshift bell rope until the town's defenders managed to repel the latest assault on the gates. Only then had he slumped against the wall, face gray with pain, and growled at Anselm to find something to staunch the bleeding. That had been 3 days ago. Now Anselm sat alone in the tower, listening to his stomach growl louder than the bell ever had. The town's food situation had gone from dire to desperate. What little stores remained were being rationed with monastic precision, and the bell ringer, despite his vital role, wasn't high on the priority list. His last meal had been a handful of boiled barley, so undercooked it crunched between his teeth, and a cup of water that tasted suspiciously of the leather pouch it had been carried in. The boy who'd brought it, one of the kitchen runner lads with more bravery than sense, had been pale with terror the entire climb up the tower stairs. He thrust the food at Anselm like a pagan offering to a temperamental god, then fled before the inevitable arrows started flying again. Anselm couldn't blame him. The journey to the tower had become a gauntlet. Enemy archers had grown wise to the supply runs, and now watched the route with predatory patience. The last water carrier had taken an arrow through his foot, and the bread he'd been carrying had tumbled down the stairs in a tragic, crumbly demise. Wind whistled through the arrow slits, carrying with it the ever-present stench of smoke and something darker, the first hints of decay from bodies left too long in no man's land. Anselm's tongue felt thick in his mouth. His lips had cracked. Even blinking had become an effort, his dry eyes scraping like gravel with each movement. Below, the siege ground on. The Duke's forces had taken to firing flaming arrows after dark, not just at the tower, but at any building that might catch. Twice now, Anselm had watched townsfolk scramble to douse fires while arrows rained down on them. It was cruel. It was effective. And worst of all, it was working. A scuffling sound on the stairs made him tense. Too light for Reynard. The captain was still recovering below, his wound festering despite the barber surgeon's best efforts. Too hesitant for one of the guards. The trapdoor creaked open, and a small, grimy face peered through. "Got food," whispered the girl. Maybe 10 years old, her dress more patches than original fabric. She held up a cloth bundle, with the reverence of someone carrying holy relics. Anselm nearly wept. "How did you?" "Cook says they shoot less at kids," she said matter-of-factly, crawling into the tower and pushing the bundle toward him. "Says we're harder to hit." The bundle contained half a loaf of bread, stale but blessedly mold-free, and a strip of dried meat so tough it could have been used to resole shoes. Anselm fell upon it like a man possessed, tearing off a chunk of bread with his teeth, and nearly choking in his haste to swallow. The girl watched with academic interest. "You eat like my dog," she observed. Anselm paused mid-chew. "What's your name?" "Marie, Doxer, Intersilmens, Yxvadinkelipikatiat." She plopped down cross-legged, eyeing the bell with curiosity. "Papa says you're keeping us alive with that thing." Anselm glanced at the makeshift rope, at the bloodstains on the floor, at the dozens of arrows still embedded in the walls. "I suppose so." "Must be hungry work," Marie said, fishing in her pocket and producing a withered apple. "Here, saved this from yesterday." The apple was small, wrinkled, and probably the most beautiful thing Anselm had ever seen. He took it with hands that shook slightly. "Thank you." She shrugged. "Can't have you falling over. Who'd ring the bell?" As if on cue, the distant sound of horns echoed from the enemy camp. Marie's eyes widened. "They're coming again?" Anselm listened. The horns weren't the attack signal, not yet. But they weren't retreat either. Something was happening. He forced himself to his feet, apple forgotten, and peered out the window. The Duke's men were forming up, but not for another assault on the gates. Instead, they'd brought forward a new contraption, a tall wooden frame with a platform at the top. Even as he watched, archers began climbing it, taking position high above their comrades. Anselm's blood ran cold. They weren't just shooting at the tower randomly anymore. They were building a vantage point to pick him off with precision. Marie, sensing the change in mood, edged toward the stairs. "I should go." Anselm nodded, his mouth dry again despite the food. "Tell your father." He trailed off, unsure what message to send. That the bell might fall silent soon? That the end was coming? Marie solved the problem for him. "I'll tell him you said thank you for the apple," she said, and vanished down the stairs like a ghost. Alone again, Anselm stared at the enemy's new archer's perch. He had maybe an hour before they were in position. Maybe less. He took one last bite of the apple, sweet, tart, impossibly vivid against his starved palate, then set it aside and took up the bell rope. However much time he had left, he intended to spend it ringing. Chapter 7. The Lonely Vigil. Time in the tower had taken on a strange liquid quality. Days bled into nights, meals came at unpredictable intervals, and the only constant was the bell's demand to be heard. Anselm had begun marking the passage of hours by the changing angle of sunlight through the arrow slits, tracing slow arcs across the stone floor like the hand of some enormous celestial clock. The enemy's new archer platform had been completed 2 days prior. Since then, Anselm had developed a tic, a compulsive ducking motion every few minutes, even when no arrows were flying. His shoulders stayed permanently hunched, anticipating impact. The muscles along his spine had knotted themselves into stubborn ridges from tension. Sleep, when it came at all, was shallow and punctuated by jerky awakenings at every distant shout or creak of the tower's aging timbers. He'd started talking to himself. Not proper conversations, just muttered observations, and half-remembered bits of scripture that circled in his head like vultures. Sometimes he'd catch mid-sentence, realizing he'd been repeating the same phrase for minutes on end. The Latin verses from his monastery days blended strangely with siege observations until his mumbling took on a surreal quality, Domini diriginos, right into that formation of crossbowmen. The worst were the lulls between attacks. When the fighting subsided and the town below held its breath, the silence pressed against Anselm's eardrums like physical weight. In those moments the tower became not just a prison, but a magnifying glass for every dark thought. He'd count the arrows embedded in the walls, 37 at last, Tally. He traced the cracks in the bell's bronze surface, 3 major fissures radiating from the spot where the last fire arrow had struck. He'd imagine, in vivid detail, exactly how it would feel when an arrow finally found its mark. Occasionally, voices from below would float up to him, snippets of conversation from passing guards, the occasional laugh, once a drunken rendition of what might have been a love song or possibly a drinking ballad. The lyrics were slurred beyond recognition. These human sounds should have been comforting. Instead, they emphasized his isolation. He was part of the town's defense, yet separate from it, like a finger that had been severed yet still somehow felt pain. Marie's visits became his only tether to sanity. The girl came every other day now, her small frame slipping through the trapdoor with whatever scraps the kitchen could spare. Today's offering was a heel of bread and, miracle of miracles, a strip of dried apple. "They're shooting at the well," she announced, settling onto her usual spot. "Papa says we'll have to start rationing the vinegar water soon." "Anselm paused, mid-chew. "Vinegar water?" Marie nodded solemnly. "They pour vinegar in the stale barrels so it keeps longer. Tastes like licking a sword, Papa says." She watched as Anselm resumed eating. "You look worse than last time." "Thank you for that assessment, Dr. Murray. Bonin. I'm serious. You've got—" She gestured vaguely at her own face, indicating some unspecified horror. "All sorts of things happening." Anselm could only imagine what he looked like. Between the perpetual dust, the sweat, the dried blood from various nicks and scrapes, and what he suspected might be the early stages of scurvy, he probably resembled something dug up from a grave. A shout from below made them both start. Marie scrambled to the window. "They're bringing the ram again." Anselm joined her, his bread forgotten. Sure enough, the familiar crew of armored men were wrestling their massive battering log into position. But something was different this time. They'd wrapped the ram's head in wet hides, the steam still rising from the freshly soaked skins. Fireproofing. The first thunderous impact shook the tower. Marie grabbed Anselm's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "You should ring." He hesitated. The Archer platform was fully manned now, a dozen bowmen tracking every movement in the tower. To approach the bell was to invite a hail of arrows. Another crash. The gates groaned audibly, even at this height. Anselm made his decision. He grabbed Marie and pushed her toward the stairs. "Go. Now, tell your father to barricade your door." "But the bell—" "I'll handle the bell." As Marie disappeared down the steps, Anselm turned to face his bronze nemesis. The makeshift rope swayed gently, as if beckoning. Outside, the ram struck again. Somewhere below, a woman screamed. Anselm took a deep breath, grabbed the leather strap, and pulled just as the first arrow whistled through the window. Chapter 8. The Nightwatch. The arrow missed by the width of a prayer. It buried itself in the bell's bronze flank with a high, quivering ping, the shaft vibrating like a plucked lute string. Anselm didn't flinch. He kept pulling the makeshift rope, the bell's deep voice drowning out the twang of bow strings and the inevitable cries from below. Night fell like a damp cloak over the besieged town. The ram had finally withdrawn after 12 brutal hours, leaving the gates sagging but still intact. The defenders had reinforced them with everything they could find. Overturned carts, piles of rubble, even the massive oak pews from the cathedral. It wouldn't hold forever, but it might hold until dawn. Anselm slumped against the tower wall, his arms leaden from hours of ringing. The enemy archers had ceased fire with the fading light, their deadly platform now just a darker shadow against the starless sky. Below, the town lay quiet except for the occasional cough or moan from wounded men. Even the ever-present crying of hungry children had stilled at last. He was alone. Truly alone for the first time in days. Marie wouldn't risk the stairs in darkness, and Reynard, if Reynard still lived, would be busy organizing the night watch. The tower had become Anselm's solitary purgatory. its stones holding the day's heat like a baker's oven even as the night air turned chill. A scraping noise from below made him freeze. Not the rhythmic tread of a guard's boots, but something furtive, something trying not to be heard. Anselm's hand crept toward the knife at his belt, a pathetic thing borrowed from the kitchens, better suited for peeling turnips and fighting. The scraping came again, closer now, near the top of the stairs. The trapdoor lifted a finger's breadth. A sliver of faint torchlight appeared, then an eye, wide and white in the gloom. Saint Benedict's bones, Anselm breathed, lowering the knife. You'll get yourself killed. Marie wriggled through the gap, clutching a small bundle to her chest. Brought you dinner? She whispered. And this. She held up a stubby candle in a clay dish, its feeble flame guttering in the draught. The dinner proved to be 2 boiled turnips and a scrap of salt pork, so small it might have been a thimble. Anselm devoured it anyway, the salt stinging his cracked lips. Marie watched with solemn approval, her knees drawn up to her chin. You shouldn't be here, Anselm said between bites. The stairs are dangerous in the dark. Marie shrugged. More dangerous out there. She jerked her chin toward the window. Papa says they'll try the gates again tonight. Says sieges always go worse after dark. Anselm peered out at the enemy camp. Fires dotted the plain beyond the walls, but their glow revealed little. The Duke's men could be sleeping, or praying, or sharpening their knives for a night assault. There was no way to tell. The candle burned lower, its wax pooling in the dish. Marie's eyelids began to droop. Anselm nudged her gently. You should go back down, sleep in a proper bed. She shook herself awake with visible effort. Can't. Papa's on wall duty till morning? A yawn swallowed her next words. Said I should stay with you. Safer up here. Anselm nearly laughed. Safer tycker und not also see in the arrow-riddled tower, with the enemy's best archers waiting for first light to resume their target practice. But he said nothing, only adjusted his cloak into a makeshift pillow for the girl. Marie was asleep in moments, her breathing deep and even. Anselm envied her that, the ability to surrender to exhaustion despite the danger. He hadn't known such rest in weeks. Every creak of the tower's timbers, every distant shout from the walls, every rustle of the night wind set his nerves jangling. The candle guttered out, plunging them into darkness. Anselm strained his ears against the silence. Somewhere an owl called. Closer by, a rat scuttled through the thatch. Normal night sounds. Nothing to indicate an impending attack. And yet, he crept to the window, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The enemy fires still burned, but their pattern had changed. Fewer now, spaced farther apart. A classic ruse, make it appear the camp slept while secretly mustering men elsewhere. Marie stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Anselm watched the shadows beyond the walls, his fingers gripping the stone sill until his knuckles ached. Waiting, Gaito. Always waiting. A new sound cut through the night, the metallic snick of steel on stone. Then another, and another, coming from the eastern wall. Anselm's breath caught. Grappling hooks. He lunged for the bell rope, then froze. Ringing now would wake the town, yes, but it would also tell the climbers exactly where they'd been spotted. He needed to see them first, to count them, to know if this was a feint or the real assault. The first black-clad figure crested the wall near the granary, moving with silent precision. Then another, and another. Marie sat up suddenly, her small hand clutching Anselm's sleeve. What is it? She whispered. Anselm didn't answer. He was already pulling the rope with all his strength, the bell's alarm shattering the night's fragile peace. Below, the shadowy figures hesitated, then broke into a run. The Nightwatch had begun. Chapter 9. The Bell Ringer's Dilemma. The bell's voice shattered the night, its brazen scream echoing across rooftops and alleyways. Anselm kept pulling, his muscles burning, each toll vibrating up his arms and into his hollow chest. Below, the dark figures on the wall scattered like roaches exposed to light, some continuing their assault, others turning back to the ropes that had brought them up. Marie clung to his robe, her small body pressed against the tower wall. "They're inside," she whispered, her voice nearly lost beneath the bell's din. Anselm saw them, too. 4 men had made it over before the alarm. They moved with grim purpose toward the gate mechanism, blades glinting in the sporadic torchlight. If they succeeded, the entire siege could be over by dawn. The first arrow came from nowhere, embedding itself in the wooden beam beside Anselm's head with a solid thunk. The enemy archers on their platform had woken quickly. Another followed, then another, forcing him to duck behind the bell's massive bulk. The ringing faltered as he lost his grip on the makeshift rope. In that moment of silence, the world seemed to hold its breath. Anselm could hear the shouts from below, as townsfolk tumbled from their beds to defend their homes. He could hear the scrape of steel on stone as the infiltrators worked at the gate winch, and he could hear Marie's rapid, frightened breathing beside him. He reached for the rope again just as another arrow whizzed past, close enough to part the hairs on his forearm. The dilemma crystallized with terrible clarity. Keep ringing and become a pincushion, or stop and doom the town to a silent, unprepared slaughter. Marie solved it for him. Before he could react, she darted out from cover and grabbed the dangling strap. The bell gave a single off-kilter clang before an arrow buried itself in the wood, where her small hands had been a second earlier. "Don't!" Anselm yanked her back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "They'll kill you." But the gate. Another volley of arrows peppered the tower, one finding its mark in Anselm's thigh with a hot burst of pain. He gasped, falling to one knee, blood already soaking through his robe. Marie's eyes went wide with terror. Below, the sounds of fighting intensified. The infiltrators had been discovered, but not before the portcullis winch began turning with agonizing slowness. The gates were opening. Anselm made his choice. He shoved Marie toward the trapdoor. "Go. Find your father now." "But you're—" "Go." As Marie scrambled down the stairs, Anselm turned back to the bell. The arrows still flew, but more sporadically now, the archers distracted by the chaos below. He grabbed the rope with both hands, ignoring the fiery pain in his leg, and set the bell screaming again. This time, he didn't stop. Not when an arrow grazed his temple, sending blood trickling down his face. Not when his palms blistered and split against the rough leather strap. Not when his vision blurred from pain and exhaustion. The bell had to ring. The town had to know. Through the arrow slit, he watched the drama at the gates unfold like some macabre puppet show. Townsfolk swarmed the infiltrators, makeshift weapons flashing in the torchlight. The portcullis had risen barely a foot before being jammed by someone's clever use of a cart axle. Outside, the Duke's forces milled in confusion, their planned entry thwarted. Anselm kept ringing. The sky lightened by imperceptible degrees, the black night softening to gray. The archer's platform came into focus, its occupants now more concerned with packing their gear than shooting at towers. The siege wasn't over, far from it, but this night's battle had been won. Only then did Anselm allow his hands to fall from the rope. Only then did he notice how the blood from his thigh had pooled on the floorboards, dark and sticky. Only then did he realize he couldn't feel his fingers. He slid down the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Somewhere below, voices shouted orders, women cried, and children wailed. Normal sounds of a town that had survived another night. The trapdoor creaked open and Reynard's haggard face appeared, his bandaged shoulder freshly bloodied. He took in the scene at a glance. The arrows, the blood, the trembling monk propped against the wall. "You're a terrible bell ringer," he said hoarsely. But you're still the best we've got. Anselm tried to laugh, but it came out as a wheeze. Do I get a raise? Reynard didn't answer. He was already shouting for the surgeon. Outside, the first true rays of dawn touched the tower's heights, painting the blood-stained stones in rosy gold. Somewhere in the distance a lark began to sing, its cheerful melody absurd against the backdrop of smoke and ruin. Anselm closed his eyes, the bell's final echoes still thrumming through his bones. He'd rung. The town had heard. For now, that was enough. Chapter 10. The Enemy's Prize. The Duke's War Council had been clear about priorities when they reconvened at dawn. Their maps lay spread across a looted oak table in the command tent, weighted down by daggers and cups of heated wine. The town's defenses had been marked in meticulous detail. The weakened gates, the collapsed section of the eastern wall, the positions of the remaining archers. But one feature dominated the discussion more than any other. Silence that damned bell tower, the Duke had growled, rubbing at his bloodshot eyes. I want that monk's head on a pike before sundown. His commanders had nodded, their faces grim. The bell had become more than an alarm. It was the heartbeat of Bourvaux's resistance, the defiant pulse that kept the town fighting, when by all rights they should have surrendered weeks ago. Each toll mocked the Duke's authority, each clang bolstered the defenders' morale. And so the orders went out. Concentrate fire on the tower. Offer gold to any archer who could pick off the rangy monk who haunted its heights. By mid-morning, the bombardment began in earnest. Anselm felt the shift immediately. Where before the arrows had come in sporadic volleys, now they arrived in disciplined waves, peppering the tower with such relentless precision that he could barely move from his crouch behind the bell. The makeshift rope hung limp, just beyond reach. To grab it meant exposing himself to a dozen waiting bowmen. Down in the streets, the townsfolk had noticed too. Marie's father, a barrel-chested blacksmith named Guillaume, organized teams of children to gather fallen arrows for reuse, darting between buildings like rabbits under hawk's shadow. The blacksmith himself risked the open square to shout up at the tower. "They're paying 2 silvers per shot at you," he called, his voice strained with something between admiration and concern. Anselm couldn't muster a reply. His wounded leg throbbed beneath the blood-stained bandages, and his throat had gone raw from swallowing dust. Instead, he raised a trembling hand in acknowledgement, then ducked as another arrow splintered the wood where his head had been. The Duke's obsession with the tower became its own kind of perverse advantage. As the enemy focused their efforts upward, the defenders managed to shore up the battered gates with scavenged timber and scrap metal. The baker's wife, a formidable woman named Mathilde who stood nearly 6 feet tall, organized teams to pour boiling oil from newly constructed platforms along the walls. Even the children contributed, forming bucket brigades to douse the occasional fire arrow before it could take hold. Yet still, the arrows came. By noon, the tower resembled some bizarre metallic hedgehog, its wooden beams bristling with shafts. Anselm counted 7 new arrows embedded in the bell itself, their steel heads leaving dimples in the ancient bronze. He'd taken to crawling on his belly to move about, keeping below the level of the arrow slits. Even so, another shaft had found his shoulder, a shallow but painful wound that made pulling the rope an exercise in agony. Marie appeared unexpectedly just as the sun began its downward slide, wriggling through the trapdoor with a water skin clutched to her chest. She'd tied rags around her feet to muffle her steps, and her face was smeared with soot for camouflage. "Thought you might be thirsty," she whispered, pressing the skin into his hands. The water tasted of leather and smoke, but Anselm drank greedily, spilling as much down his front as into his mouth. Marie watched the enemy camp through an arrow slit, her small face pinched with concentration. "They brought up the big catapult," she said matter-of-factly. Anselm choked on his water. "What?" "Papa says it's called a peria. Throws stones the size of melons." She turned from the window, her expression far too calm for a child, describing siege engines. "They're aiming it at the tower." As if summoned by her words, a deep thrum echoed from the enemy lines. Anselm barely had time to grab Marie and flatten himself over her before the first stone struck. The impact shook the tower to its foundations. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling as the massive projectile slammed into the lower levels, sending cracks racing up the ancient stones. For one heart-stopping moment, Anselm thought the entire structure might collapse beneath them. But the tower held, for now. Marie squirmed out from under him, her eyes wide but dry. That was loud. Another thrum. Another impact, this one closer. The tower groaned like a living thing in pain. Anselm made his decision. He grabbed Marie by the shoulders. "You need to go, now, all the way down, don't stop for anything." "But what about up?" "Go." As Marie scrambled down the stairs, Anselm turned back to the bell. The Duke wanted silence. He'd give him one last symphony. Ignoring the arrows that now flew thicker than ever, ignoring the ominous cracking sounds from the tower walls, ignoring the blood soaking through his bandages, he grabbed the rope and pulled with all his remaining strength. The bell's voice rang out across the town, clear and defiant as the first stones began to fall. Chapter 11. The Narrow Escapes. The first stone had been a warning. The second, a promise. By the third impact, Anselm had developed a peculiar sixth sense for incoming projectiles, a tightening between his shoulder blades that preceded each bone-rattling crash by half a heartbeat. He'd learned to press himself against the north wall when that feeling came, where the tower's thickest buttresses might shield him from falling debris. The bell, miraculously, still hung intact, though its bronze surface now resembled a badly dented pot. Anselm had taken to ringing it in quick, irregular bursts, just enough to maintain the town's morale without presenting an easy target. This strategy had saved his life 3 times already that morning. The first near miss came as he reached for the rope at dawn. An arrow meant for his heart struck the bell instead, ricocheting with a musical ping that left his ears ringing. The second, more terrifying, occurred when a catapult stone sheared off the corner of the roof, sending a hail of tiles crashing down where he'd been standing moments before. But the closest call happened quietly, almost politely. Anselm was crouched by the eastern arrow slit, peering at the enemy camp through the forest of embedded shafts, when a strange whistling sound made him turn. A single arrow, not from the massed ranks below, but from some lone marksman positioned on the half-collapsed tannery roof, flew straight through the slit with unnatural precision. It would have taken him clean through the eye had he not chosen that exact moment to sneeze. The shaft buried itself in the opposite wall, its fletching trembling like a living thing. Anselm stared at it, his nose still tingling from the dust that had saved his life. Somewhere, he fancied he could hear death itself sighing in frustration. Marie brought word of the assassin later that afternoon, crawling through the trapdoor with her usual disregard for danger. "They call him the Crow," she whispered, pressing a wedge of hard cheese into Anselm's hand. "Where's Old Black?" "From the Free Cities." Anselm cued mechanically, watching the tannery roof through narrowed eyes. "How do you know this?" "Cook's nephew delivers food to their camp at night. Says the Duke offered the Crow a whole gold crown for your head." She eyed the arrow still lodged in the wall. "He nearly got it too." The cheese turned to ash in Anselm's mouth. A gold crown was more than most peasants saw in a lifetime. Enough to buy land. A bride. A new identity far from any siege. Another stone struck, this one low on the tower's western face. The entire structure shuddered, sending a fresh cascade of dust and pebbles raining down. Marie grabbed Anselm's arm as the floor tilted alarmingly beneath them. "They're not trying to kill you anymore," she said once the rumbling stopped. "They're trying to bring the whole tower down." Anselm knew she was right. The enemy's strategy had shifted. Why waste arrows on one annoying monk when gravity could do the work for them? He looked around at his crumbling prison, at the bell that had become both his purpose and his curse. The once proud tower now resembled a ruined tooth, its stones loose, its beams splintered, its very bones groaning under each fresh assault. Marie tugged at his sleeve. "Come down, just for tonight. They won't know." Anselm hesitated. The bell had become more than metal and rope. It was the town's heartbeat, its defiance. To let it fall silent would be to admit defeat. Another impact. Closer this time. A section of the ceiling near the trapdoor collapsed in a roar of shattered timber. Marie screamed. Anselm moved without thinking, throwing himself over the girl as debris pelted his back. Something heavy struck his shoulder with bruising force. Another clipped his temple, sending bright sparks across his vision. When the dust settled, the trapdoor was buried beneath a mound of broken beams and shattered roof tiles. Marie coughed, her small face white with dust. "We're stuck." Anselm rose unsteadily, testing his limbs. Nothing broken, though his entire body ached. The tower swayed slightly in the wind, its structural integrity clearly compromised. Outside, the enemy cheered. They must have seen the damage. Another whistle. Another impact. The floor beneath them buckled suddenly, dropping several inches with a sickening crunch. Anselm grabbed Marie and the bell rope in the same motion. "Hold on to me." As the next stone struck true, as the tower finally gave up its long struggle against gravity, as the world dissolved into chaos of falling stone and screaming timbers, Anselm wrapped one arm around Marie and the other around the rope, and let the bell's own weight carry them through the collapsing floor. Bronze met stone with a final deafening clang that drowned out even the sound of the tower's death throes. The last thing Anselm remembered was the rope burning through his palms, the bell's mighty voice ringing in his ears, and the curious thought that at least now, finally, he might get some rest. Chapter 12. The town's indifference. Consciousness returned in jagged pieces. The smell of burning thatch, the taste of blood, the muffled sound of distant shouting. Anselm opened his eyes to find himself sprawled across the bell itself, his body draped over its cold bronze curve like a discarded cloak. The tower had collapsed inward rather than outward, its ancient stones too stubborn to fall any direction but down. Miraculously, the bell had caught on some unseen protrusion, leaving it suspended a mere 10 feet above the wreckage. Marie stood beside him, her small form wedged between the bell and the remnants of the tower wall. She blinked up at him, her face white with dust except for 2 clean tracks where tears had cut through. "You're alive," she croaked. Anselm tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every muscle screamed protest, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Broken, likely. He looked around at their precarious perch. The bell swayed slightly with each movement, its remaining supports groaning ominously. Below, through gaps in the rubble, he could see townsfolk moving about their business as if nothing had happened. A woman carried a basket of laundry. 2 men argued over a barrel of salted fish. A group of children played some game involving sticks and a leather ball. No one looked up at the ruined tower. No one came running to dig them out. Marie followed his gaze. "They don't know we're here," she whispered. Anselm said nothing. The truth was far worse. They knew. They simply didn't care. The bell had served its purpose, and now it was gone. So too, presumably, was its ringer. Life in Bordeaux went on. From their vantage point amid the wreckage, Anselm could see the full scope of the town's indifference. The baker had reopened his ovens, the scent of fresh bread mingling incongruously with the stench of siege. The blacksmith hammered at some piece of armor, his rhythm undisturbed by the catastrophe overhead. Even the guards on the walls kept their watch facing outward, never glancing back at the ruin that had been their town's voice. Only Guillaume seemed to remember. The blacksmith paced below the wreckage, his face turned upward, calling Marie's name with increasing desperation. His voice barely carried over the general din of the town. Anselm tried to shout, but his throat produced only a dry rasp. The dust, the blood loss, the sheer exhaustion of weeks under siege had stolen his voice as thoroughly as the collapse had stolen his bell. He tugged weakly at a piece of broken timber, sending a small avalanche of debris clattering downward. Guillaume looked up, his face lighting with hope. "Marie!" The blacksmith began digging with bare hands, heaving aside stones that would have taken 3 men to move under normal circumstances. Others slowly took notice. First a pair of washerwomen, then a guardsman, then a handful of children abandoning their game. Within minutes a small crowd had gathered to help, their movements sluggish with the lethargy of long hunger. Anselm watched the rescue efforts with dull eyes. He had spent weeks sacrificing his body, his sanity, his very soul to keep these people safe. And now, only when one of their own was in danger did they rouse themselves to action. Marie squeezed his good hand. "They're coming," she said. Anselm nodded, too tired to explain that it wasn't him they were coming for. The first rope snaked up through the wreckage, thrown by a guardsman with surprising accuracy. Marie teetered around her waist with practiced knots, then looked to Anselm expectantly. "You next," she said. Anselm shook his head. "Can't climb," he mumbled, gesturing to his broken arm. Below, Guillaume had produced a makeshift stretcher from a door and some blankets. The townsfolk argued about the best way to secure it, their voices rising in familiar bickering. Marie hesitated, then began climbing down with the sure-footedness of youth. At the last moment she turned back. "They'll come for you," she promised. Anselm leaned back against the bell, watching the girl descend to safety. The rope went slack, then disappeared as they untied it to fashion some means of lowering him down. He closed his eyes, listening to the familiar sounds of Borvo carrying on below. The bell, his constant companion through all this madness, swayed gently beneath him, its silence louder than any toll. Chapter 13. The Final Toll. The voices below grew louder, more urgent. Anselm kept his eyes closed, letting the sway of the damaged bell rock him like a child's cradle. The pain in his arm had settled into a dull, distant throb, as if it belonged to someone else. He could hear the townsfolk arguing about the best way to reach him, their debate punctuated by the occasional clatter of shifting debris. Then a new sound cut through the chatter, the sharp blare of war horns from beyond the walls. Anselm's eyes flew open. That wasn't the Duke's signal. The tone was all wrong, deeper, more resonant, coming from the North Road. The remaining townsfolk scattered, abandoning their half-hearted rescue efforts to rush toward the walls. Even Guillaume hesitated, torn between his daughter and the new threat. Marie tugged at his arm, pointing up at Anselm, but the blacksmith shook his head and ran toward the commotion, dragging Marie with him. Alone again, Anselm craned his neck to see through the gaps in the wreckage. The Duke's forces were scrambling, not advancing. Their neat siege lines dissolved into chaos as horsemen poured in from the northern woods, not the Duke's colors but the silver and blue of the neighboring barony. Relief forces. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in Anselm's throat. Of course. The one day he wasn't ringing the bell was the day help finally arrived. The bell shifted beneath him with an ominous groan. One of its remaining supports gave way, dropping the massive bronze dome another few feet with a lurch that sent fresh agony through Anselm's broken arm. The movement sent a shower of stones tumbling down into the square below, where they shattered with the sound of breaking crockery. No one noticed. The battle, if it could be called that, was over almost before it began. The Duke's men, already exhausted from weeks of siege, broke and ran at the first charge. The townsfolk poured out through the damaged gates, some wielding kitchen knives and farming tools, their long-pent rage giving them courage. Anselm watched it all from his precarious perch, a silent spectator to his own salvation. The bell shifted again. This time the sound was final, decisive. The last support was going. Anselm scrambled for purchase, his good hand slipping on the smooth bronze. Below, the wreckage yawned like a mouth, promising either death or deliverance, depending on how the stones fell. Then he saw it, the rope, the original bell rope, miraculously intact, snaking down through the rubble to the square below. If he could reach it, the bell dropped another inch. Anselm lung, his fingers brushing the frayed hemp. Missed. Tried again. This time his hand closed around it just as the final support gave way. The bell fell with a sound like the end of the world, tearing through the remains of the tower in a cacophony of shattered stone and screaming metal. Anselm held tight to the rope, his body slamming against the wreckage as he swung in a wild arc toward the square below. He hit the ground hard, rolling to disperse the impact. Around him, the townsfolk finally took notice, their cheers for the relief force momentarily interrupted by this new spectacle. The bell landed with a final deafening crash, embedding itself halfway into the cobblestones as if driven by divine hammer. Dust rose in a great cloud, obscuring everything. When it cleared, Anselm stood swaying before the ruined tower, still clutching the rope in his good hand. His robes hung in tatters, his face was caked with blood and dust, and his left arm hung at that unnatural angle. But he was alive. Silence fell over the square. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, "Ring it!" Others took up the cry. "Ring the bell!" Anselm looked down at the rope in his hand, then up at the ruined tower, then out at the expectant faces of the townsfolk who had ignored his suffering for weeks. With the last of his strength, he pulled. The bell, half buried in the stones of Bourvau's square, gave one final, thunderous toll. And then, with a sound like a sigh, it cracked clean in two. The crowd erupted in cheers as if this too was part of some grand plan. Anselm sank to his knees, staring at the broken bell. His work, it seemed, was finally done. Marie broke from the crowd, darting through the legs of the celebrating townsfolk to throw her arms around his neck. "You did it," she whispered. Anselm patted her back weakly with his good hand. Around them, the people of Bourvau celebrated their deliverance, already forgetting the man who had helped make it possible. Somewhere beyond the walls, the Duke's forces fled. Somewhere in the crowd, the blacksmith embraced his daughter. And somewhere in the ruins of the tower, the broken bell lay silent at last. Anselm closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, no one needed him to ring anything. Chapter 14. The silence after. The celebrations lasted well into the night. Bonfires dotted the square where the broken bell lay, their light dancing across the cracked bronze like liquid gold. Ale flowed freely from casks the townsfolk had hidden during the siege, and the relief soldiers became instant heroes, their helmets filled with whatever scraps of food remained. Laughter echoed through streets that had known only fear for weeks. Anselm sat apart from it all, his back against the base of the ruined tower, his broken arm now splintered and bound by the barber surgeon's rough hands. The man had worked quickly, his attention already drifting to more interesting patients before the splint was secure. Marie had stayed by Anselm's side for a time, but even she had been drawn away by promises of honey cakes and music. Dawn came too brightly. The revelers stumbled to their beds as the sky lightened, leaving the square littered with empty cups and trampled flowers. Anselm watched the sun climb over the broken walls, its rays touching first the highest points of destruction, before slowly illuminating the wreckage below. No bell rang to mark the hour. At first, no one noticed. The town slept off its celebrations while Anselm sat vigil by the broken bronze. It wasn't until mid-morning that the first signs of unease appeared. The baker, red-eyed and yawning, paused in his work to glance nervously at the empty tower. The guards, changing shifts, hesitated, unsure how to mark the rotation without their accustomed signal. By noon, whispers spread through the marketplace. People glanced upward at odd moments, as if expecting the familiar sound to resume at any instant. Children playing near the square paused their games whenever a particularly loud noise echoed through the streets. mistaking it for the first toll of a bell that would never ring again. Guillaume found Anselm still, sitting by the ruins, methodically picking splinters from his palms. The blacksmith cleared his throat awkwardly. "We could make a new rope," he offered, staring at the shattered bell. Anselm said nothing. The rope wasn't the problem. The bell itself lay in pieces, its great crack running like a lightning bolt from lip to crown. Even if they reforged it, the tower that had given it voice was gone. Reynard appeared next, his wounded arm in a sling, his face unreadable. "The Baron's men leave tomorrow," he said. "They've offered to take the wounded to his keep." He nodded at Anselm's splintered arm. "You could go." Still, Anselm remained silent. The thought of leaving Borvo should have brought relief. Instead, it settled in his stomach like a stone. Evening fell without ceremony. The townsfolk went about their business, but their movements lacked rhythm, their routines unmoored from the markers that had structured their days. Supper was eaten too early or too late. Night watchmen dozed at their posts, having no bell to keep them awake. Marie returned as the last light faded, settling beside Anselm with a crust of bread and a wedge of cheese. "They're saying the Duke got away," she said between bites. "Ran like a rabbit when the Baron's men came." Anselm accepted the food with a nod. His voice, when he finally found it, came out rough as gravel. "They'll rebuild the tower." Marie followed his gaze to where the wreckage lay. Not the same one. No, never the same. The new tower would be sturdier, its stones set square and true. The new bell, when they cast it, would ring clearer and louder than the old one ever had. And the new bell ringer. Anselm closed his eyes. In his mind he could still hear the deep, familiar voice of his bronze companion, its tones vibrating through wood and stone and flesh. The sound had been woven into his bones these long weeks, until he couldn't say where the bell ended, and he began. The first star appeared overhead. Somewhere in the town a baby cried. An unaccustomed quiet settled over Borvo, so complete Anselm could hear the rustle of bats' wings as they flitted between broken rooftops. Marie leaned against him, her small warm weight a comfort against the growing chill. "What will you do now?" she asked. Anselm looked down at his splintered arm, at the rope-burned palms, at the dust still clinging to his tattered robes. A lifetime ago he had been a simple monk, then a reluctant hero. Now there was only silence. Chapter 15. The Forgotten Hero. Years later, when travelers passed through the rebuilt market square of Borvo, they would admire the new bell tower with its gleaming bronze bell and marvel at how the sunlight caught its polished surface. The children would point to the statue of Baron Durand on his warhorse at the center of the square, his sword raised in eternal victory over the defeated Duke. Occasionally, a particularly observant visitor might notice the faint depression in the cobblestones where something heavy had once fallen, but none would guess its significance. The baker who once complained about the noon bell interrupting his naps now complained about its absence, making him lose track of time. The guards who had cursed the nightly tolls now found themselves waking at odd hours, their bodies still remembering a rhythm the town had abandoned. Guillaume the blacksmith crafted a new weather vane for the tower, shaped like a bell with a crack down its middle, though he couldn't say why the design pleased him. Marie grew tall and fierce, apprenticing at her father's forge until she could swing a hammer better than any man in the county. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she would pause in her work and look toward the square, expecting to hear something that never came. As for Anselm, he left with the Baron's men that next morning, his broken arm still aching in the damp autumn air. The townsfolk barely noticed his departure, busy as they were rebuilding their homes and lives. The Baron's physician set his bones properly, and in time they healed, though they ached before rain for the rest of his days. He returned to his monastery briefly, but the quiet prayers and orderly life that had once comforted him now felt hollow. The brothers whispered about how he would startle at loud noises, how his hands still moved in phantom bell-ringing motions when he thought no one was looking. After a year he left quietly in the night, taking nothing but the rope-burned scars on his palms as souvenirs of his service. Legends grew around Borvo's siege as legends do. The bards sang of Baron Durand's heroic charge, of Guillaume the blacksmith single-handedly holding the gates, even of little Marie sneaking through enemy lines with messages. But no songs were written about a dusty monk in a crumbling tower. Years turned to decades. The old tower stones were carted away to build new homes. The broken bell was melted down to cast the new one, its metal purified by fire, until no trace of its former shape remained. The children who had once gathered fallen arrows grew old and told their grandchildren exaggerated tales of the great siege, none of which included a bell ringer. One summer evening, when Marie was an old woman and the new bell tower had stood for 30 years, a traveling friar passed through Borvo. His back was bent, his face lined with years, but his eyes were sharp as they surveyed the bustling square. He paused by the statue of the Baron, studying the inscription that credited the nobleman with saving the town. A young girl selling flowers nearby noticed the stranger's peculiar smile. "Something funny, Father?" she asked. The old friar shook his head. "Just thinking how history gets polished like that bronze up there," he said, nodding toward the bell tower, "until all the interesting edges wear away." The girl shrugged, uninterested in philosophy. "Want a flower for your robes, Father?" The friar patted his pockets, but found only dust. As he turned to go, the girl called after him, "Wait!" She tucked a small blue flower into his frayed sleeve. "For luck." The bell tolled the hour then, its voice clear and strong where it once had been muffled by dust and desperation. The friar's hands twitched at his sides, but he didn't look up. Marie, now gray-haired but still sharp-eyed, watched from her bench by the forge as the stranger disappeared down the north road. She said nothing to the apprentices working beside her, but that night, long after the shops had closed, she returned to the square alone. The old woman placed a single iron nail on the barely visible depression in the cobblestones where the original bell had fallen. It was a small thing, meaningless to anyone but her. But as she straightened, the wind carried the faintest echo of a familiar sound, or perhaps just the memory of one. Above her, the new bell hung silent in its perfect tower, waiting for morning.